Welcome back to the Knife Life. Today we're going to be talking about heat treating and tempering, what it is, and why we knife guys care. What do you think of when you think about knife making? A lot of you are probably thinking about a bladesmith pounding hot steel on an anvil, or a maker grinding a blade to shape in a shower of sparks. And these are obviously very important parts of knife making. These are the methods of creating the shape of the blade, but it's not enough just to pound and grind a piece of steel into the correct shape. We have to manipulate the chemistry of the steel as well in order to create a usable knife. What does that do? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's say you order some steel from your supplier. When it arrives at your door, it is in no condition to be sharpened or used for cutting. It may not seem like it, but the steel is soft and weak. The edge will wear away at an unacceptable rate. Any impact on the edge will cause it to roll, and the blade itself is liable to bend and warp under duress. Now, before you start panicking and calling your steel guy demanding answers, you should probably know that the steel is supposed to arrive that way. And in general, a bladesmith wants the steel to arrive that way as well. Soft steel is easier to work with when grinding and machining, for example. It also means that the bladesmith has a blank canvas to work on for their own heat treat and temper. But we can't leave the steel in this condition forever. So, after the bladesmith finishes their rough shaping, they perform a heat treat. Now, heat treating is what makes the steel hard, and we're not talking kind of hard, we're talking about Charlie Sheen level of partying hard. A properly heat treated blade is very similar to a piece of glass. It doesn't give, it doesn't bend, and it is abysmally difficult to work with. Now, if you were to leave the knife in this condition and then sharpen it, you would note that it would hold an edge for an extremely long time. So why wouldn't we just stop here? At this stage, the knife can literally shatter if you drop it onto a hard surface. It's somewhat akin to having an obsidian glass knife. The edge retention is fantastic, but if you look at it funny, it might break. Quite literally as well. The stresses in the steel are great enough that if you leave a knife in the heat-treated state for too long, it may actually spontaneously develop cracks. Hearing that high-pitched ting from across the room is never fun. So, after the heat treat, you want to move to the temper as soon as possible. The temper is essentially a controlled softening of the blade. Heat treating cranks the hardness of the blade up as far as we'll go. Tempering allows us to drop the hardness of the blade back to where we want it to be, depending upon what we are making. A chef's knife will typically be capped as hard as can be reasonably managed. A sword or Bowie knife, on the other hand, will be tempered softer in order to increase the resistance to shock. By adjusting the temper, we can match the characteristics of our blade to the task it was created for. This is where the saying, "the steel is the heart of the blade, but heat treating is the spirit," comes from. So, now we know about how heat treating and tempering influences our knife. Let's take a look at how it does that. So, let's do some knife science. Steel, at its simplest, is made of two constituent elements, iron and carbon. These two elements work together in order to form a structure at the atomic level. Think of a simple box. Then put one iron atom at each corner of that box. Now put a carbon atom in the center of the box. In steel, this is what is called ferrite, and that is the preferred structure of our favorite material at room temperature. Another possible structure in our steel is austenite. Take the box with the irons at the corners, get rid of the carbon in the center, and put one carbon in each face of the box. Now, you have austenite. We can achieve this structure by cranking the heat up dramatically. Depending upon the steel, this can be between 1300 to 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. So, aside from the temperatures that we can find these two structures at, what's the difference? Well, as it turns out, the austenite structure can hold a lot more carbon than the ferrite structure. Think of the steel as a pot of water and carbon as salt. You can only dissolve a certain amount of salt in water. Any extra just ends up sinking down to the bottom of the glass. If you heat up the water, you'll find that you can dissolve more salt. A similar mechanism occurs in steel with carbon. Most steels, especially the ones used for knives, have an excess of carbon. As a result, you have the formation of carbides, and predominantly one known as cementite or FeC3. These carbides exist in the steel alongside the ferrite, similar to our salt grains in the cold water. Now, we have all of our building blocks in order to understand our heat treat. During a heat treat, we take a room temperature ferrite steel with cementite and heat it up to convert the steel to its austenite structure. In order to perform a proper heat treat, we want to make sure that the steel is heated enough that all of the ferrite and the cementite in our steel is converted to austenite. Now, if we were to slowly cool everything back down, the steel would simply go back to the ferrite structure and the extra carbon would migrate out of the structure and form cementite again. But we don't do that. Instead, we rather rudely dunk our steel into a cold bath and cool the steel as fast as we possibly can. What this does is cause a rapid transformation of the austenite structure back to the ferrite structure faster than the carbon can adjust to. As a result, much of the carbon gets trapped instead of reverting back to its carbide state, and it gets trapped in the ferrite structure. This creates a great deal of stress in the structure and yields what metallurgists call a body-centered tetragonal structure. The distortion in the chemical structure is what increases the hardness of the steel. The greater the amount of carbon, the greater the amount of distortion, and the greater the hardness of the steel. But, as mentioned before, hardened steel left at room temperature can sometimes form cracks in the material as the steel relieves some internal stresses over time. As a result, tempering occurs immediately afterward. So, after getting our steel all hot and bothered and then pouring the equivalent of ice water over it, it's rather understandably stressed. So, how do we relieve that stress? Well, we need to move some of the carbon that we just put into the ferrite structure out of said ferrite structure. And given that the carbon is unhappy in its current location, it would be more than happy to leave, but it can't since it doesn't have the energy to overcome the energy barrier to relocate. Now, a few of you who paid attention in chemistry class are starting to think, hey, making things hot is a way of supplying something with energy, and you thought you would never get anything useful from that class. The temperature of the blade is increased in order to allow a portion of the carbon to migrate out of the ferrite structure, allowing a relaxation of some areas from the body-centered tetragonal structure back to a cubic body-centered structure. This carbon precipitates out into the steel as a carbide. This isn't a particularly quick process, and the blade is usually held at temperature for usually 2 hours at least. Higher alloy steels often require multiple tempers due to their complexity. The temperature the blade is held at for the temper varies due to the properties of the steel itself and the desired characteristics of the blade. But it also increases the toughness of the blade to an acceptable level. Tempering, thus, is often a juggling act between hardness and toughness and is controlled through the tempering temperature. A higher temperature means more carbon migration, which, as a rule of thumb, means reduced hardness and improved toughness. For those paying attention while I had the data sheets out, you may have noticed that the required temperatures for a temper are relatively low. For a knife maker on a budget, note that most of the temperatures will be able to be obtained with a household oven. One of the most underutilized tools in a knife maker's kit is the lowly toaster oven. Overall, tempering is one of the simpler operations in knife making. For the new knife maker out there who isn't sure about how hot they should temper, here is some free advice. Start at the lower temperatures. You can always retemper at a higher temperature, but not at a lower temperature. Now, all of this was a simplified view of what goes on in steel during heat treating and tempering. There's still a lot more to learn about heat treating and tempering if you're interested. One source that is both free and written for knife makers is a book written by Dr. Verhoven, the same gentleman who worked with Alfred Pendray on Wootz Damascus. You can find it for free online. And if that doesn't quench your curiosity with steel, then I can recommend Steel Metallurgy by S.K. Vandal. This book is more technical and it addresses steel in general. It will take your steel metallurgy knowledge to the next level. I'll have links to both of these in the description below. If you have any questions or would like a clarification, hit me up in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you haven't already, I could always use another subscription or a video share in order to keep the channel going and get more content out to you guys. And as always, stay safe and keep living the knife life.